The first time she saw him, he was standing at the edge of town like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break, dust curling around his boots, hat tipped low against the merciless sun. The kind of man folks whispered about when lanterns burned low and whiskey ran thinner than courage. And even before she knew his name, she knew he carried trouble the way other men carried saddles. Natural and worn smooth by years of hard riding across unforgiving land, the town of Red Hollow had never trusted strangers, not since cattle went missing and 2 good deputies were laid beneath dry soil with no preacher brave enough to ask questions. And when that tall rider guided his black horse past the weather-beaten sign creaking in the wind, every window along Main Street filled with watchful eyes, curtains twitching like nervous fingers. Because out here on the frontier, a man without history was often a man running from it. From the balcony above the sheriff's office, Clara Whitmore watched him with a steady gaze that had unsettled many men twice his size. Her dark hair pulled back tight, chin lifted with quiet defiance. She had grown up among rifles and wanted posters, had learned to read tracts before she learned to embroider, and though the townsfolk saw only the sheriff's daughter, she saw something else entirely when she looked at the stranger, something wounded beneath the steel. Down below, inside the sheriff's office thick with cigar smoke and old grudges, Sheriff Thomas Whitmore studied the very same man through narrowed eyes, his jaw working slow like he was chewing on bad news, because he knew that face from a crumpled poster folded in his desk drawer, a poster bearing the name Caleb Kane and a bounty big enough to buy half the territory, accused of train robbery, cattle rustling, and the killing of a lawman out near the Colorado line. Caleb Kane dismounted with the calm of someone who had survived worse towns than this, boots striking the dirt with deliberate ease. He tied his horse outside the saloon and walked through swinging doors that groaned like they disapproved of his presence. And inside the piano faltered mid-tune, as if even music knew better than to cross a hunted man, his spurs chiming a slow rhythm that set every nerve on edge. Clara descended the wooden steps from the balcony, ignoring her father's barked command to stay put, because she had never been the kind of woman to live in the shadow of fear. And when she pushed through the saloon doors, the scent of whiskey and sweat wrapped around her like a warning. She spotted him at once, seated alone at a corner table, back to the wall, eyes scanning exits the way a soldier counts bullets, their gazes locked across the dim room, and in that silent exchange lay more truth than any courtroom confession. His eyes were not the eyes of a murderer, she thought. They were tired eyes, watchful and burdened, and when she approached, ignoring the collective intake of breath from the patrons, she felt the weight of her father's reputation pressing against her spine. Yet she kept walking, boots steady on scarred floorboards. Outside, Sheriff Whitmore pinned the wanted poster against his desk once more, fingers tracing the inked outline of Caleb Kane's face, unaware that destiny had already begun weaving threads too tangled for bullets to sever. Because while he prepared to hunt the outlaw riding under a cloud of accusation, his own daughter stood face to face with the very man he had sworn to bring in, dead or alive, and neither of them yet understood that the coming storm would not spare blood or Badge. By sundown, the town of Red Hollow had split itself clean down the middle, not with gunfire yet, but with whispers sharp as barbed wire, because word had spread that the stranger in the saloon was none other than Caleb Kane, the outlaw with a bounty high enough to make honest men reconsider their virtue. And Sheriff Thomas Whitmore wasted no time calling his deputies together beneath the fading orange sky, his voice carrying across the street like a verdict already decided, telling them that no man who spilled a lawman's blood would walk free while he still wore a badge, though beneath that iron certainty stirred something colder, something closer to fear, for Kane had slipped through tighter traps than this before, and Whitmore knew that cornered wolves did not beg, they bit. Inside the saloon the air had thickened with expectation, long and heavy as the moment before a duel. Caleb remained seated, but every muscle in his frame was coiled, his fingers resting near his holster not in threat but in readiness, and Clara stood across from him with a defiance that startled even herself, asking him straight and plain if the stories were true, if he had robbed trains and killed deputies and ridden through towns leaving widows behind him. And Caleb answered her not with bluster, but with a quiet steadiness that did more to shake her faith in the wanted poster than any denial shouted in anger could have done. He said a man can be guilty in ink without ever being guilty in truth, and he spoke of a job gone wrong, of masked riders and a lawman shot by someone else's hand, of blame falling fast on the one man who survived long enough to be named, Clara had grown up believing her father's word was the final measure of justice, that the badge he pinned to his chest each morning shone brighter than doubt. Yet, as she listened to Caleb's low voice telling of betrayal and false witness, she felt the steady ground of her upbringing begin to shift beneath her boots, because she had seen liars before, and they boasted or trembled. They spun tales too neat or too wild, but this man did neither. He simply spoke like someone tired of running from a shadow he could not outride, and when she asked him why he had come to Red Hollow knowing the sheriff hunted him, he surprised her again by saying he was done running, done letting rumor decide his fate. He had come for proof hidden in this very town, proof that could clear his name or seal it forever. Outside, Whitmore's deputies fanned out like hounds catching scent, rifles in hand, boots grinding into dust that had witnessed more than one reckoning, and the sheriff himself stood in the middle of the street staring at the saloon doors as though he could see through them, through wood and smoke and stubborn pride, all the way to the man he had sworn to capture, unaware that his daughter stood not as hostage but as question, because Clara was not pleading for the outlaw's life. She was demanding answers from both sides, and when she finally stepped out onto the boardwalk beside Caleb, every head in town turned as one, the sheriff's jaw tightening at the sight of his child standing shoulder to shoulder with the very man whose face haunted his desk drawer. The standoff that followed did not erupt in gunfire at once. Instead, it simmered beneath words exchanged across the street. Whitmore ordering Kane to drop his weapon and surrender peacefully, Kane replying that he would come in without a fight if given the chance to present evidence before a judge instead of a rope, and Clara stepping between them despite her father's furious command to move aside, her voice ringing clear as a church bell in a town that had long forgotten prayer, declaring that if Red Hollow prided itself on law, then it ought to prove it by hearing a man before hanging him. And that single act of defiance cracked something inside her father that no bullet ever could. Sheriff Whitmore had lost men under his watch, had buried friends and carried guilt like a second badge upon his chest, and in his heart the killing of Deputy Marshal near the Colorado line had never been just another case. It had been personal, because Marshal had been more than a deputy. He had been kin in all but blood, and when the reports came naming Caleb Kane as the shooter, Whitmore had clung to that certainty the way drowning men cling to driftwood, refusing to imagine a world where vengeance might be misdirected. Yet now, as he looked at his daughter shielding the accused outlaw, doubt crept in like winter through cracked shutters, quiet but impossible to ignore. Caleb reached slowly into his coat under the watchful aim of half a dozen rifles, and withdrew not a weapon but a folded paper, creased and stained from travel, explaining that it was a ledger page taken from the rail company office after the robbery, a page listing payments to hired riders meant to stage chaos and claim insurance, including the name of a man Whitmore trusted, a man who now stood among the deputies gripping his rifle too tight, and as Caleb tossed the paper onto the dusty street, the wind tried to claim it, but Clara caught it first, scanning the names with widening eyes until one name struck like a hammer, Deputy Carl Hensley. Silence spread heavier than smoke as all gazes shifted to Hensley, whose face had drained of color faster than a gambler's purse at a crooked table. And in that silence truth felt closer than ever, because guilt has a way of revealing itself without confession. Whitmore's hand trembled, not from age but from realization, as he ordered Hensley to lower his weapon. Yet the deputy instead raised it higher, shouting that Kane was lying, that the outlaw had forged the page. And in that moment lines were drawn not between town and stranger, but between truth and fear, between a father's oath and a daughter's faith. And the first shot finally cracked through the evening air, not from Caleb Kane's gun, but from the man desperate to keep his secrets buried beneath red hollow dust. The gunshot split the evening like lightning across dry prairie sky, sharp and merciless, and for one suspended heartbeat no one moved. Not Clara, not Caleb, not even Sheriff Whitmore. Because the sound carried more than lead, it carried truth clawing its way to the surface. And when the echo faded, it was clear that Deputy Carl Hensley had fired wild in panic, the bullet tearing splinters from the saloon post instead of flesh, and that single desperate act told Red Hollow more than any testimony ever could. For innocent men do not shoot to silence paper. Caleb moved then, not with reckless fury but with precision born of too many narrow escapes, his revolver clearing leather in one smooth breath of motion. Yet he did not fire to kill, he fired to disarm. the crack of his weapon ringing out as Hensley's rifle spun from his grip and landed in the dirt with a thud heavy as guilt. And townsfolk, who had braced for bloodshed, found themselves staring instead at a truth unfolding faster than rumor could keep up. Because the outlaw they had feared had chosen restraint, while the deputy sworn to protect them had chosen fear. Sheriff Whitmore stepped forward through the settling dust, his boots slow but certain, and for the first time since that wanted poster had crossed his desk, he looked at Caleb Kane not as a hunted man but as a question demanding an honest answer. Clara stood between them still, though now she trembled not from fear but from the weight of what had nearly happened, and Whitmore ordered 2 deputies to secure Hensley in irons, his voice stripped of rage and left only with authority. And as the disgraced deputy was hauled upright, he spat curses that sounded thin and hollow against the widening understanding of the crowd. Hensley's confession did not come easy. It spilled out jagged and bitter once he realized his silence had already shattered. He spoke of the rail company scheme, of hired riders meant to stage a robbery convincing enough to justify inflated insurance claims, of panic when Deputy Marshal stumbled onto the truth and recognized Hensley among the masked men, and of the fatal shot fired not by Caleb Kane but by Hensley himself in a moment of selfish desperation. Afterward, it had been easier to let blame fall on the lone survivor who had no friends in uniform to defend him, easier to let a bounty silence a conscience. The revelation settled over Red Hollow like the first cool breeze after months of drought, uncomfortable yet cleansing, because towns built on frontier law survive by believing in it, and the idea that their own deputy had twisted justice for profit cut deeper than any outlaw raid. Sheriff Whitmore listened without interruption, each word carving away at years of certainty, and when Hensley finished, the sheriff removed his hat not in shame but in solemn acknowledgement that he had chased the wrong man across half the territory, that vengeance had blinded him where patience might have revealed the truth sooner. Clara watched her father as though seeing him anew, understanding at last that strength is not the absence of mistake but the courage to confront it. And when Whitmore turned to Caleb, there was no hatred left in his eyes, only the steady resolve of a man determined to mend what he could. He announced before the gathered townsfolk that the charges against Caleb Kane would be formally withdrawn, that he would ride under escort to the territorial judge with the recovered ledger as evidence clearing his name, and that Red Hollow would not hang an innocent man to preserve wounded pride. For Caleb the moment carried no triumph, only a weary relief that felt almost foreign. He had grown accustomed to doors closing and rifles rising, not 2 hands lowering in recognition of truth, and when Whitmore stepped closer offering neither handshake nor hostility, but simple acknowledgement, it was Clara who bridged the last of the distance with a faint smile that spoke of storms weathered together. She had risked her standing and her father's trust on a feeling she could scarcely explain, yet standing there in the hush of a town transformed, she knew she would make the same choice again. Morning found Red Hollow quieter than it had been in years, as if the town itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Caleb prepared his horse for the ride to clear his name officially, though now he rode not as prey, but as a man reclaiming what had been stolen, and Clara stood beside him beneath a sky washed clean by night winds, her father watching from the boardwalk with a gaze no longer hardened by blind pursuit, because the hunt had ended not in death but in truth. And while no one could say what roads lay ahead for a sheriff's daughter and the man once hunted by her father, one thing was certain: the West had carved them both into something stronger, and in that wide, unforgiving land where bloodlines and badges once clashed, justice had finally chosen the braver path.